Welcome back to the Brewer Fanatic podcast. We are your hosts, Jack Stern and Spencer Michaelis. We got a lot to go over. This is, I wouldn't call it an emergency pod, but there's a podcast that's inspired by a slew of transactions that we've had over the last few days. A lot of it simply relating to the Brewers needing to set their 40-man roster as the offseason begins. The World Series is over. All of that stuff is in full effect. But before we dive into that, how are you doing tonight, Spencer? It's a midweek recording session for us. It's a little bit unusual.
Yeah, definitely a different day for us. I'm doing okay. The Bucks are breaking my heart currently, but I'm gonna push through that for some Brewer stuff. But yeah, I'm doing fine. Otherwise, I don't need to talk Bucks. I've already done that. I'm done with them for now. But
I can speak
we'll
from
take my
I
mind
can
off.
I can speak from experience here. If you want to put Spencer in a bad mood, you can innocently ask, "Why aren't the Bucks good?" I sent that text to you a few nights ago. You didn't react very well, and I had to explain. I'm legitimately asking. I'm not making fun of the Bucks. I don't follow any basketball, so I need you
Yeah,
to lay this out for me. But we're not going to talk about that here. This is a Brewers podcast, and we have quite a little bit to dive into here over the next several minutes. We'll start first with some awards news. So the Brewers taking home a couple of Gold Glove awards this year. Bryce Terang winning at second base in the NL, and Sal Frelick winning in right field in the NL. Not a whole lot to talk about here, but just really nice to see a couple of guys who are a very big part of the Brewers' ability to keep runs off the board getting rewarded for that. When we talk about the Gold Glove, people might not like that I'm going to say this because a couple of Brewers won, but the Gold Glove awards largely suck. They're generally
yes,
not great at determining the best guy. I think in some instances, if you have a guy who is more established and is consistently an elite defender year in and year out, I think that tends to work out pretty favorably. Like you look at a guy like Nolan Arenado or Matt Chapman, guys who won a lot of Gold Gloves at third base, and that's because they just established that reputation. But guess what? They also hit enough to put themselves on the map a little bit more to get to that point. But then you also have the examples of guys who were most arguably the best defensive player at that position in that given year who didn't win because maybe they didn't have the name recognition, maybe they didn't hit well enough to really put themselves on people's radars. This whole thing is voted on by other coaches and other managers, and I think that's a flawed system because these guys are not seeing these players play defense every single day. They get to see them when they play against some of these guys, but it's just not the most consistent, well laid out set of criteria. In fact, there really is no criteria. You're basically just asking these guys to vote for who they think was the best out of a pool of guys who they've maybe seen for fleeting samples for the entirety of the year. So again, if you have guys who really are that consistent as one of the best defenders at a position and they are established, that can work out pretty well and you end up with a pretty good result there. You can also have it go in a different direction, though, where a guy has that reputation as a great defender and he doesn't have a great defensive season, and he could win that Gold Glove anyway, just because that's the nature of the game, that's the nature of the voting, and what information those people are able to process or remember or apply to that vote that they cast. But nonetheless, these are two guys who definitely deserved it, so it's good to see them get that recognition. And if we're going to talk about defensive awards, I think the Fielding Bible is a much better way to go if you're looking for an accurate award. But the reality is, it's just not going to have the same level of recognition, the same level of widespread attention put on the Gold Glove Award. So I think it was really awesome for both of these guys to get that national recognition that they really haven't gotten for their work in the field.
yeah, I agree completely. I think the fact that they were probably two of the worst hitters on the Brewers too, and still were able to garner this type of recognition for the reasons you talked about, almost makes it even more impressive that they were able to attract that much attention and clearly made that much of an impact on the coaches that are voting on this, for them to be able to recognize that despite the fact that they were both below average hitters, and really they aren't established in the same way that you've talked about. Like, they haven't. Bryce was obviously on the ballot last year, but they don't have that same level of recognition as guys like Arenado and Chapman, like you talked about, and even Yadier Molina, those types of guys. Just it didn't really matter what they did. They were almost always going to be finalists, if not winning for a long stretch there. And it feels like it's getting a little bit better, I guess, just looking across the landscape of the Gold Gloves in terms of the voting. But like you said, I still think the Fielding Bible one is always going to be a more accurate representation. But for the players, I would imagine a Gold Glove means more to them just because it has that level of recognition that the Fielding Bible ones don't. So, yeah, I think this is great for Terang. It's great for Free Lake. It only helps when you get recognition nationally for doing the little things and doing well on the defensive side of the ball. It makes you even more inclined to continue to just try to perform super well on that side. And it brings recognition to all of the value that they brought this year when that might not have always been, talked about during the season, but it's cool to see them get that nationally after the season too. So happy for those two, especially more than anything else.
Both of those players as Gold Glove winners are now in the running for the Platinum Glove. And unlike the Gold Gloves, the Platinum Glove is voted on by the fans. All the finalists are the respective Gold Glove winners at each position in the National League and in the American League. And from that pool, fans vote on the best defender out of all of them. And then they take home either the AL Platinum Glove or the NL Platinum Glove. Voting for that is open through Thursday evening. So that's the deadline for if you want to cast a ballot for Sal Frelick or Bryce Terang. Bryce Terang, I think, has a very solid case as the deserving Platinum Glove winner. I mean, this is the guy who led all defenders across Major League Baseball at any position in defensive runs saved with 22. I think he's got as compelling as a case as any in terms of just looking at how he performed on the field. Is he going to win it? I'm not expecting him to because, again, you're competing against some names that have a little bit more recognition, higher profile. And I just talked about how flawed the coach and manager voting can be. The fan voting can also be equally, if not more, flawed because you have guys who not only are they not seeing these players very often, they also just aren't generally going to have as great of instincts or as great of an eye to go off of. So I think in some regards, fan voting has gotten a little better in some areas because the wealth of information that's out there now publicly for evaluating players, I think fans, especially the hardcore fans, have started to pick up on more of it, have started to learn a little bit of this, and they apply it a little bit. I mean, most of the people I'd be willing to bet who are either listening to us or watching us right now have at least a preliminary understanding of a lot of this stuff. And if you don't, that's okay too. But I think that helps a little bit in that regard. But still, you're talking about, a voting process that is probably not necessarily going to lead to the most deserving guy getting it. But Bryce Terang definitely deserves to be in consideration on that front. Another award for the Brewers as well. This one on the executive side, Matt Arnold was voted by his peers as the executive of the year in Major League Baseball. The GM meetings are going on right now at this moment. So Matt Arnold voted as the executive of the year for this Brewers team that he was able to put together. Again, another deserving award for someone in the Brewers organization. Matt Arnold has been around for quite a while in this organization, and I know he only recently, within the last few years, took over as the head of baseball operations, but he's also someone who is very much a little more behind the scenes as the right hand man to David Stearns even before this, but he was always the guy who was laying a lot of groundwork to get the Brewers to this state of being consistently competitive. So, really good to see Matt Arnold pick up that award. Very deserving as well. Hopefully, we'll have more coming. Pat Murphy, I would imagine, has a pretty good case for manager of the year, especially because that just tends to be the which team overperformed expectations the most
Yeah.
award. That's probably going to be a big part of the criteria if he wins it, but I do think he should also be in that camp just for his leadership abilities. We've talked about kind of how we feel about the in-game and strategy management and all that stuff, but I don't think you can really debate, especially if you've been around him or if you followed the Brewers, just how much he's meant to that clubhouse the whole time he's been here, especially since he took over that lead managerial job. So we'll see in the coming days, potentially more awards coming for the Brewers, but already pretty well represented in the early goings of awards season. With that, we can move on to the main focus of this episode, which is going to be a lot of roster news. First of all, one of the deadlines that we had come up with in the last few days was the deadline to extend qualifying offers to players. And the Brewers extended a qualifying offer to Willy Adames. That's not surprising. Everyone expected that this was going to happen. Quick rundown for people who might not be familiar with it. The qualifying offer can be offered to eligible players who are entering free agency who have exceeded their years of standard club control. And this year, the qualifying offer was $21.05 million. These are all 1 year deals that you can extend to players, but it needs to be that $21.05 million. So the Brewers have extended that offer to Willy Adames. He's going to turn it down. That's not a report. That's just everyone knows this is going to happen. He's going to
Yeah.
pursue a payday in free agency as he's earned that right. So the Brewers have put this offer out there. And then because the Brewers are considered a revenue sharing team, if Willy Adames signs elsewhere, because they have extended this qualifying offer to him, if he signs elsewhere, the Brewers are going to get a draft pick. And Spencer, I know you're kind of the draft guy. So do you want to break down the specifics of that a little bit more?
Yeah, for sure. So really the main thing is if Willy signs anywhere else, the Brewers will receive a draft pick. Now, there's a number that matters here in terms of money, and it's total money. It's not average annual value. It's based on the total value of the contract. But if Willy Adames signs for at least 50 million total, which would be a shocker if he doesn't, I think everyone's expecting quite a bit more than that on the total value. The Brewers would be awarded a pick between the first round and the competitive balance round A. So it would be directly after the first round ends. There can be multiple teams that have this happen, so it doesn't necessarily mean they'd be the first pick after the first round, but they'd be in that realm or that area of the draft. If he happened to sign for less than 50 million, the pick would come after the competitive balance round B, which is after the second round. So it'd be about 40 to almost 50 picks lower in some cases, depending on, well, probably closer to 40, but about 40 picks lower if he signed for less than 50. Again, that would be a huge shock to everyone involved. And honestly, if he signed for less than 50 million, I would imagine it would be back with the Brewers if I just had to guess if that happened to be the case after everything was said and done. But yeah, so it sounds like most likely the Brewers are going to end up with a pick directly after the first round. Not only does that matter because you get a chance to take another interesting prospect at that point, but it adds to all of the slot value stuff. And we talked about this back when we went through our draft preview before the actual draft this year. But basically what that does is it adds to your pool. It allows you more wiggle room. It allows you to be more creative in the draft room to try and move money around, try and pick up more high school kids. Usually is where you're trying to save that money for, so you can sign them away from their college commitments. And this would add normally in the range of a couple more million to the pool, which is, it's a big deal over the course of a draft. You can usually get two relatively big prospects for around that type of money being added. Or again, you could use that opportunity to take someone that you like a lot that you weren't able to take with your first round pick. Now you could take two guys that you really, really like. So it gives a lot of flexibility in the draft. And it seems like that's what's going to happen here. I mean, I think it would be a huge upset if Willy does return. And again, it'd be probably an even bigger upset if anywhere he signed was for less than 50 million total. So this seems like a 99% likelihood of happening. So it'll be a good thing for the Brewers. Obviously, the loss of Willy will be a bad thing for the Brewers, but it's a nice little bit of, they didn't trade him, obviously. So this is a nice way to kind of recoup some of the value that you might have got in a trade while also getting to keep Willy all of last season where he was extremely productive. It's a nice trade-off, I think.
In a story at The Athletic within the last 48 hours, Willy Adames did comment on what his future could look like, where he could potentially end up. And he did mention that he would take a discount to re-sign with Milwaukee. But if you read the rest of his quotes, I really want people to not take that and run with it, because I do think that's the part of the quote everybody is going to latch onto. But just in the interest of completeness here, I want to read the full quote from Willy Adames. He said, "I'm willing to stay here for less money, let's say, but I just want to be fair for what I deserve in my career and whatever I've done. We just have to wait and see where we're at. You never know what's going to happen, and you never know who's going to be willing to make that commitment with me for a long time." He also talked about the potential of playing for a bigger market team like the Dodgers, who are expected to be in on him this offseason. And he said he doesn't have any concerns about playing for a big market team after only spending the entirety of his career to date with two of the smallest markets in baseball in Tampa Bay and Milwaukee. But the way I'm interpreting this is I do think Willy Adames would take a discount to stay here, but that discount still needs to be largely pretty competitive with the other offers he's getting.
Yes.
So if he's got a lot of offers on the table and the Brewers are, let's say they're swimming in the same pool, but they're a little closer to the shallow end. Maybe that's the analogy to run with here. I think there's a possibility. The problem is the Brewers are not going to be swimming in the same pool or the same waters as these other teams. It's going to be most likely a huge discrepancy between what the Brewers are going to be willing to offer and what other teams are going to be willing to offer. But we'll see how it unfolds. I think he's a very interesting case, especially because of how badly the defense fell off this year. I have pretty serious concerns about how Willy Adames' bat is going to age. I think the Brewers have gotten the best offensive seasons from him that he is likely to have the rest of his career, particularly 2024. I don't like that he's generally never been a super patient hitter. I know the walk rates improved significantly the last 2 years, and his walk rates are actually quite good. His chase rate was still not great even after he improved it. It basically got to league average after it was quite a bit below league average for a few years. He's got a long swing. He takes some wild swings because that's just kind of how he's built as a player. It's a very big swing, a very powerful swing, but that also makes it a very long swing. So I worry about with guys like that as you get older and the bat speed maybe starts to go a little bit, and you're not a guy who's really used to being a super patient hitter. I think there is the potential for a pretty quick and abrupt fall off there. And Jake McKibben actually wrote up all of this stuff a few months ago, right at the beginning of the offseason, basically at Brewer Fanatic. You should go check that out if you haven't, because he outlines all of this stuff very nicely. But those are concerns for me. You could alleviate some of those concerns, though, if you knew that he could stick at shortstop long term, because there's a lot of built in value to being able to play a high quality shortstop, which he had done for the entirety of his Brewers career until this year. He was a bad defender at shortstop this year. Not just shaky, inconsistent. He was a bad defender. The errors racked up really quickly. The defensive metrics did not like him. Outs above average, which is the one that's always been the most optimistic about him, that went down to 0 this year for him, basically saying he was an average defender. I have some questions about outs above average for evaluating infield. I think DRS is probably the gold standard for that. Not that that's perfect, but if we're looking at what all of these metrics take into account in the way that they get to the conclusions they get to, I think DRS is probably the best one for infield. DRS had him, last I checked, I think it was somewhere in that negative 16 range. I don't have the number right in front of me, but it was double digits in the negative, which is not good. That made him one of the worst defensive shortstops in baseball by that measurement. So now the question becomes, is that a blip on the radar, which that's going to have to be what his agent is able to convince teams that it was a blip on the radar, or is this a start of defensive decline? I'm inclined to believe it's the latter. And if it is, now the question becomes, okay, does he have to move off a shortstop pretty quickly? If he does, and he has to move to, say, third base, and now you have to consider that contract as more like signing a third baseman than a shortstop, because that could be where he plays the majority of that deal. And if he's at third base and the bat falls to league average, below league average, all of a sudden that's looking like a not so great contract, even with all of the value he brings with the intangibles in the clubhouse and on the culture side of things. He's got a very interesting case, and it's very interesting because the Dodgers are always named as the top suitor. The Dodgers are a very smart organization. So if these are red flags, I am sure the Dodgers see them. Granted, if you're the Dodgers, you also simply have the resources to make that investment anyway and survive if it doesn't work out. Not every team. Most teams have that, but a team that's in Milwaukee's market size, if you're trying to still turn a profit, doesn't have those same margins to play with. The Dodgers are a really smart organization, and I think this could go very easily go one of two completely different ways. Number one, the Dodgers see these red flags and they don't get into a bidding war with other teams. And I think if that happens, his market has the chance to deflate very, very significantly from where maybe his camp thought it was. I know a lot of people right now are kind of projecting like a 6-year, 160 million type arrangement. I think that's a pretty decent benchmark. My guess is he's going to shoot for a little more with the knowledge that they might have to negotiate toward that. But if the Dodgers are not seriously in the picture because they have these concerns about him, I do think he could drop more into like a 4-year, a little bit over 100 million range. Then it starts to become a little bit more interesting. But the other way I think this could take is the Dodgers look at him and they see something they can fix with the defense. And he suddenly transforms back into a plus shortstop, and they give him a big deal, and it works out great because he's able to stay at shortstop. I think of Manny Machado a few years ago when he was not a good shortstop, a guy who had played mostly third base, but always profiled better as a third baseman. Orioles traded him to the Dodgers, and his defense turned around quite a bit at shortstop after he went to LA. I think this is an area that's very real, like teams knowing how to improve something like this. It's just something that's not discussed a lot. It's something that's so tricky to pin down too, because it's one of the few areas that we just cannot quantify very well, especially from our perspective and from our vantage point. But this is a really interesting case. I don't think he comes back to Milwaukee either way. But I think there's a decent range of outcomes here, a decent range of possibilities for where that contract can land. And you also have to look at some of these other shortstops who have signed these kinds of deals. Trevor Story, Javi Baez. Now, Willy Adames is better than Javi Baez ever was, in my opinion, as a hitter.
Yes.
And I think he'll continue to be. Javi Baez, I talked about Adames being a little iffy with the chasing. Javi Baez was always going to chase anything you threw off the plate to him. So when you're a guy who strikes out a lot and chases everything and never walks, that was just a terrible decision by Detroit. I'm not sure exactly how you expected that guy to age. Trevor Story, I think that was a deal that looked a lot safer. Even that one hasn't played out great for Boston. So maybe there's a little bit of built-in, I don't want to say fear, but a little bit of this built-in caution from teams. But there's a wide range of ways this could go. I'm kind of curious to see what you think about it. But I don't think he comes back to Milwaukee either way. I'm sure there will be some contact and some discussions, but I don't think he comes back either way. But regardless, I think this is going to be very interesting to watch the way it unfolds.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think everything you said about the Dodgers is basically what I've been thinking. I have a feeling that they're going to lean more towards the belief that they can fix him, especially just the fact that a lot of it probably did boil down to errors. And I think there was worse routes, and we talked about it throughout the season. Like I think he regressed a bit in terms of the way he was attacking balls and doing stuff. But I think more than anything, it was errors starting to weigh on him and kind of affecting the way he went after baseballs because he was in his head a little bit. It looked to me like a guy who was mentally in a slump defensively. And there were other things. And like I said, I do think that he regressed in terms of just his routes to the ball and his jumps off the bat a little bit, but I don't think they were terrible. He just booted a lot of really easy plays this year that he hadn't done before. And that's going to kill him in DRS, those types of things. Like it's going to crush him. So when you pile up a bunch of errors, like that kind of adds up with the DRS going down just as far as it did. The Dodgers seem like a team who believed that they could do that. We also, Tommy Edman was a nice addition there, but they played Mookie Betts at short for quite a bit of the season this year. Like if they believe in the bat, I think they're still going to be willing to go after Willy. I think that's really what it's going to come down to for me, even more than the defense from the Dodgers perspective, because they will always have that ability to move him off of short if they need to. They have the ability to take on the risk of things not working out just because they are the Dodgers. And like you said, they're a very well-run organization, and they don't just take on risk to take on risk just because they're capable of doing so. But I do think Willy's the type of player that I could see them being willing to do it for. So I think for the most part, I agree. I have a hard time seeing it drop maybe as much as you're saying, but really you only dropped more the years than the average annual value. Like
Right.
I could see that happening, I suppose, like a 4-year deal instead of the 6 or 7 that they probably want because they want to lock in beyond the prime of his career here. I'm not sure too many teams will be interested in that, but that is another thing that a big market team can do, like the Dodgers, is say, you know what, we're paying for the next 4 years. We'll pay for another year beyond that, or even 2, and just be fine with it because that's what we have the ability to do here. We want him for the next 4 years, and we'll live with the last 2 because we can just kind of eat that extra salary. So it'll be really interesting to follow. I agree. I don't think he's a Brewer. I think things would have to just go way different than he, his agent, and pretty much everyone is anticipating for that to happen. But yeah, he'll be missed. I will just say that he's going to be missed for all the on-field stuff, but the off-field stuff especially. Like the Brewers will miss Willy Adames, but I also think that this is the correct way to handle it from the Brewers' perspective. I would not join a bidding war with the Dodgers and teams like that for Willy Adames this offseason.
No, before we move on, I'll say that as well. The Brewers played this entire thing flawlessly.
Yes.
There's always the balance of, do you keep a guy or do you trade a guy? Adames always very firmly fell on the side of you need to keep him for the entirety of his time here, because trading him away is going to do so much damage that you're just not going to be able to recover from in that moment. That was not the case with Corbin Burnes. I'll maintain that was not the case either with Josh Hader. I think the Brewers just handled that so poorly. And I think the players, to some extent as well, handled that pretty poorly, and they could have done a better job on that front as well. I think everyone just did a very poor job with that one, and that's why things ended up the way they did. But I think there's also a lesson to be learned there, in that maybe you can't really expect everyone to play that very well when it happens mid-season, so you do it in the offseason like they did with Burnes. But Corbin Burnes and Josh Hader were both far more replaceable than Willy Adames, because Willy Adames is your shortstop who wants to play 162 games every year, played 161 this year. He's the guy in the clubhouse in terms of establishing that culture and kind of bringing everyone together. Corbin Burnes and Josh Hader were not those kinds of guys. There's always that balance you need to play. And with Adames, it always just made more sense to keep him, so the Brewers did. And like we talked about, you give him this qualifying offer, which means you're going to get the draft compensation back. You're almost guaranteed to get that pick at the end of the first round. And that gives you the ability to kind of restock the system a little bit with an early pick. Mind you, with Burnes as well, when the Brewers traded him, they got a comp pick back for him in that deal. So they kind of had the best of both worlds, because they could have done the same thing with him and kept him for that last year and then given him the qualifying offer. Baltimore gave him a qualifying offer. He's probably not going to take that. He'll test free agency as well. But the Brewers played this thing exactly the way they needed to, assuming that they don't overpay and re-sign Adames to a deal that has a chance to really sink them within the first few years of that. So I think they should be commended for how they did this. It's going to be a different recipe and a different route for each guy, depending on a lot of factors. But all of the factors told you that Willy Adames needed to stay for the entirety of that contract. And then you let him go, get that payday from someone else, get a draft pick, and you kind of move on a little bit into this next era in the infield. With that, we can kind of move on to some more offseason stuff. So Willy Adames electing free agency, obviously, right at the conclusion of the World Series. Joe Ross did so as well because their contracts were both officially up. That then brings us to some other decisions relating to options and contracts, decisions with guys who had club control beyond this year, but didn't necessarily fully cement themselves into the long-term mix. So we'll kind of talk about some of these. We'll start first with the guy who we know is going to be sticking around in 2025. This is not shocking to anybody, but Rhys Hoskins opting into his $18 million player option for 2025. After the kind of season he had, everybody expected that this was going to be the case. Rhys Hoskins was a replacement level player in his first season with the Brewers because when you're playing a bad defensive first base and you're a slightly below average hitter, that's just the value you're providing. You can point to the 26 home runs. You can point to what Pat Murphy liked to say all the time, game-changing home runs. But at the same time, there were a lot of moments where Rhys Hoskins had more opportunities to change the game, and he didn't, or he would change the game in the wrong way. So just not a good year for him. That said, he's also a very big bounce back candidate. One more year removed from that ACL surgery. I'm inclined to think that coming back from that hamstring injury without a rehab assignment probably didn't do him any favors either. But I think if there's anything to really point to, it's mainly just the ACL recovery. It can take sometimes multiple years before guys are fully back to the level they were at before. There can sometimes be a difference between being healthy again, but really being in the zone again as well, and being in the best spot physically, mechanically, all of those things. So I think that obviously you don't really want to be attached to the 18 million. And this is what I actually wrote when the Brewers signed Rhys Hoskins last offseason. I said, this is a really abnormal signing for them because there's quite a bit of downside here to this deal. Whenever you sign a first baseman and give him this kind of commitment, this is not something the Brewers usually do. First baseman, power hitting first baseman are often a dime a dozen. We've seen just how many of them the Brewers have shuttled through in recent years. Adam Lind, Mark Reynolds, Juan Francisco, Jesus Aguilar, Eric Thames, like all of these guys, Chris Carter, all kind of similar profiles to varying degrees of production, but all kind of similar in that build of just the power hitting first baseman. We're probably not going to have super long peaks if they have a good peak. So it was a little abnormal to see them commit this kind of money to a guy, but I knew why they did it. I didn't have any problem with the deal, but there was always this built-in downside of, hey, if he comes back and he does not have a good year, you're on the hook for 18 million in 2025 for a guy who could again be replacement level. So there is now this path that was always a possibility, this path of the Brewers basically giving one of their bigger contracts in franchise history to a guy to be a replacement level player. They're on that path right now. Like, they are on the not so good scenario path. They're on like the downside path that was always there in this contract, but the bounce back potential is still there. Hopefully that's the case, because then it makes it a lot easier to swallow. It brings us to a question from Jake, who I shouted out earlier, and he asks, if Rhys Hoskins had finished the 2024 season like he started it and started it like he finished, how would you view his contract heading into 2025? So for some added context, Rhys Hoskins, at the time he hit the IL in May with that hamstring injury, he had an OPS over 800. He was essentially doing what he had always done. The slash line was exactly in that range of his career line. And then after he came back, things really fell apart for a couple months. Then he had an okay month, and then things fell apart again. And that's just kind of where it ended up. So Jake is saying, what happens if you flip that? Start really cold, heat up at the end. How would you view his contract heading into 25? I think if that was the route it would have taken, I think it would amplify that likelihood that I talked about of a potential bounce back. I think when you see that, it's easier to convince yourself he's on the right track. But that's not how it played out. So I wouldn't say a massive impact. Maybe it swings me a little bit more from being on the fence to being in the camp of he's going to bounce back. But again, I feel like you always need to take a holistic view of this stuff. So I think if you really take that step back and look at things a little more, my guess is it doesn't have a major swing on the expectations or how people view that contract. But maybe it sways the people who always are trying to be a little more optimistic about this stuff. I think that gives you just something that's a little easier to latch onto to kind of support what you're hoping for that he's going to bounce back. That's how I see it. I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on kind of what the outlook is for Reese Hoskins. Would this have changed how you felt about him if this was kind of the distribution of the same kind of production, but if it had played out in this different way, would that have changed anything for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that season-long numbers would have been better probably just because the good sample would have been larger than the small one. Because right now, the good sample was smaller than the bad one. Um, but I agree with what you're saying. I don't think it would super change my outlook on next year. I think there'd be the hope, I guess, that you could look back and say, he's coming off the ACL. He got off to a slow start. Then he has this hamstring. But then when he comes back from that, he looks like the old Reese Hoskins. I guess when I kind of spell it out that way, it would probably feel better for me heading into next year than it does currently. But I don't know. I mean, if you saw the production he got before the hamstring injury all season, I I imagine he probably still opts in, but I think it would have been a question. I think he might have
Mhm.
taken his last chance at free agency if you got that production for the whole year, because this was if he opted out this year, this would probably have been his last chance to get another multi-year deal if I had to guess. Um, Opting in, I think he's kind of admitting that he was not going to get anywhere near 18 million on the open market, and he would not have. And the Brewers do have a buyout for next year as well, too. That's going to be tied to this on a mutual, I believe. So I think it's another 4 million. That'll be it's basically 22 million guaranteed for this year played if I'm getting that buyout number right. But I know there's a buyout for sure. And yeah, I mean, like I said, I think if you got it all year and he opted in, you'd feel just fine. But if it was flipped, you'd probably feel a little bit better. I don't know if it would make much of a difference really in the way you're viewing it heading into 2025 though.
Yeah, I guess we interpreted the question a little bit differently. I was kind of working under the assumption that the season numbers would still be the same, but it's a cold start and a hot finish. But
Oh,
you took it more as if like the size of the good sample and the bad sample was also flipped. So I get you're right. There's different ways you can think about it. So um, yeah, obviously that's not as much of a discussion. Like if the season numbers are better and they're a lot closer to normal Reese Hoskins, of course everyone is going to feel a lot better. So I just took it that way, just in terms of like if the season numbers were the same, but the way he got there was a little bit different, or he finished on a better note. But I think we're kind of getting at the same point here. Like this
yeah.
is not ideal for the Brewers, but they're that bounce back potential is there. I think it's just a matter of how likely do you think he is to tap into it? But I think we agree that it's definitely there. And that would be a big boost for a Brewers offense that I think still needs quite a bit more power next year than they got this
Yes.
year. They got a lot better in that regard. But guess what, guys? You cannot small ball your way to consistently scoring lots of runs. You just can't. That's not how baseball works. That's never how the modern version of the game of baseball has worked. You gotta hit the long ball more. You gotta hit more extra base hits. And the Brewers were okay in that regard, and the outcome was they were a solid offense. But if you can just give yourself another little nudge in that direction, I think that is really going to help you close the gap between your offense and some other playoff offenses because they were still towards the bottom in terms of playoff offenses this season. But if you can get a healthy Reese Hoskins, who's a lot closer to the guy he was in Philadelphia, that definitely goes a long way. So we talked about Reese Hoskins being someone who we know is coming back after exercising an option. Let's talk about a couple of guys who had their options declined by the Brewers. We'll start with Colin Ray. So the Brewers actually first put Colin Ray on waivers because he's got that 5.5 million team option for 2025. Seemed like for most of the season that was almost a slam dunk to be picked up, but he had a really, really rough finish to the year. Brewers putting him on waivers then because they weren't planning to pick this up. So you put him on waivers. That, number one, that not only raises the chance that the Brewers can get out of having to pay him that buyout, but number two, it also just means that for Colin Ray's sake, if like a rebuilding team claims him off of waivers, now that team picks up Colin Ray's option, and he's still getting that 5.5 million from somebody else, as opposed to, the Brewers just giving him the 1 million buyout, and then, maybe he signs a lesser contract somewhere else. This is also just a good way to kind of gauge the market value for a guy. The Brewers did something very similar with Brad Boxberger a couple of years ago, where he had the club option. They put him on waivers, and it was a similar outcome here. Brad Boxberger went unclaimed on waivers. Colin Ray went unclaimed on waivers, so the Brewers giving him that 1 million buyout instead of the 5.5 million team option. And when that happens, when a guy clears waivers with that option attached to him, that tells you that there are no teams that value him in 2025 as someone worth giving that 5.5 million to. And it sucks very much for Colin Ray. It's a sobering development, because I think really essentially what happened here is, when you have a guy who is in his mid 30s, career numbers are not great. He's having that best year of his career for most of the season, and I think you can still point to what he did this year and say it was a career year, because at the end of the day, the ERA league adjusted was roughly the same as where it was last year, a little bit better, but then the volume was also way higher. So I think you can still call it a career year. But he's entering his mid 30s. So there's always kind of that question of maybe we got everything out of him that we were going to get out of him. And then you add in that really tough finish to the year. I think that very much swings the calculus in that direction of, yeah, we really did get the remaining productive innings out of him that he's probably going to have for the rest of his career. And I'm guessing just about every other team saw that as well. They probably saw that the career numbers are not great. As valuable as Colin Ray was for the Brewers, with his availability and his ability to pretty consistently keep his team in games almost every time he took the ball, teams are going to see that, well, it was a really rough finish. And if Colin Ray no longer has that dependability, suddenly his value really goes down the tank, because he's not a high ceiling pitcher. For him, the value always comes from having a fairly high floor of just being available and giving you a competitive start almost every time out. And if teams are seeing evidence that that is probably not going to be the case anymore, and it's probably a combination of the age, the career high in innings in 2024, the really rough finish as he hit that career high in innings. I think it was just too many red flags for everybody. So my guess is he'll catch on somewhere, but he might have to sign like a minor league deal now that probably gives him a decent base level salary if he makes the roster, plus some incentives built in and things like that. But I think it's jarring to some people at first, because innings eaters tend to get paid pretty well on the free agent market in today's day and age, because teams understand the value of that. But again, like if everybody thinks that Colin Ray, now in his current status and his projected status for 2025, that form of Colin Ray, if he's no longer competitive enough as a pitcher to be the innings eater anymore, you really don't know what you're getting with him. So it's an unfortunate reality. I think you still have to give Colin Ray a lot of credit for what he gave the Brewers. We've given Colin Ray plenty of love on this show, but all good things must come to an end, and I think that's just kind of the unfortunate finish that everybody arrived at here. So it doesn't take away from what Colin Ray did for the Brewers, but I think they probably played this one correctly as well. Like I said, we've seen them do this with guys before. They've done it with Brad Boxberger. Like I mentioned, they did it with Chase Anderson, except they traded Chase Anderson instead of keeping him around. They were able to find a taker there. Chris Carter, they put him on waivers as well. He ultimately ended up with the Yankees the next year. Most of the guys that they've done this with, they did it with Brent Suter as well, where they put Brent Suter on waivers and the Rockies claimed him. Most of the time, they've ended up being right. Brad Boxberger signed with the Cubs, missed most of the season with a major injury and was not productive when he was on the mound. Chris Carter went to the Yankees, only lasted, like 30-something games with the Yankees that year. He didn't make it very long. He didn't hit well. Brent Suter is one of the few that they've gotten wrong because he's continued to basically be exactly the same guy. Even though I supported that move as well because it looked like he was starting to fall off a little bit based on the peripheral numbers, but he righted the ship and just continued to be same old Brent Suter. Chase Anderson completely fell apart, though, when he went to the Blue Jays in that trade. So they've usually been right about this when they do this, and it's not unprecedented for the Brewers. I think if you would have asked people a few months ago, I think we all would have been pretty shocked. But now knowing the way that the season finished for him, I would still say if you had asked me at the end of the year if they were going to pick it up or turn it down, I probably would have said they would have picked it up still, but it wasn't like a slam dunk anymore. So I'll say this is not the outcome that I thought was the most likely, but I don't think it's completely out of the blue either. And it's not out of the ordinary, really, the more you think about it and the more you break it down. But again, unfortunate for Colin Ray. But again, credit him for everything he did while he was with the Brewers. Gave them 2 durable seasons where he was just able to eat a lot of innings, and most of those innings were quality innings that kept his team in the game. There's a lot to be said for that, but there's a lot of signs now that are pointing to him just not being that guy anymore. So the Brewers weren't going to bring him back. But again, you give him credit for what he did while he was here.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got nothing to add. I guess I will say the only thing is I can no longer make my we can rename the podcast to the Colin Ray Fan Club joke. So that one goes out the window. That one is retired, RIP. But no, we talked about it all year. We don't need to go through it again. But Colin Ray was extremely helpful to what the Brewers did this year and the year before. And I mean, it's unfortunate it's ending this way, but like you said, I think the Brewers were pretty much proven correctly just by the way that nobody claimed him. I think it's already shown that it's kind of a wide-held belief around the league that he's probably, unfortunately, just not going to be the same as he was early in the 2024 season.
Yeah, and this is how a lot of teams are going to operate anyway, especially a team like the Brewers. It's how you have to operate. Get the bargain value while you can.
Yep.
And as soon as you know that things are about to go south, you get out before it can hurt you. And they've done that with quite a few guys successfully. This is just the latest instance of that, I think, and I think they're probably going to be proven right. So, like I said, Suter is really one of the few that you can point to where they got it wrong, but even that one didn't end up hurting him because he was a reliever, and the Brewers replace relievers very easily and very consistently and very efficiently. So it's kind of just the way it has to go sometimes in this game. We'll pivot now to the other pitcher who had his club option declined, and that's Devin Williams. I think there was a lot of confusion from people as to what was going on here and what this all means. So we'll break it down for all of you if you haven't quite figured it out yet. Because if you're not super well versed in how baseball contracts and years of control and all this stuff works, it can be a little confusing. So Devin Williams last season, instead of going to arbitration with the Brewers, he signed a 2-year contract. And that second year of that contract overlapped with his final arbitration season. Basically, what that means is it's just the idea is if everything plays out the way everyone's hoping, Devin Williams doesn't have to go through the arbitration process for his final 2 years of arbitration with the Brewers because he has a productive season. Brewers pick up that team option, and everything's hunky dory. However, Devin Williams missed over half of the season, which means that the amount of money he is going to earn in arbitration is going to be lower than that team option. If he had a healthy season, the amount of money that he was likely going to earn in arbitration would have either been in that same range as that option, or it might have even been more, and the Brewers are getting a bargain, in which case they would have picked up the option. But because he's projected to make a couple million less in arbitration, so this team option is $10.5 million with a $250,000 buyout. So the Brewers are paying him $250,000 off the bat to not pick up this option. And then you add that to the $8 million he's projected to get in arbitration. So you're saving, what is it, just shy of $2 million basically by doing this.
Over. Probably
over?
About 2.25 if it's 8 million.
Okay,
plus
I did. Yeah, I can't do any mental math to save my life, so I screwed that up. But the point is, they're basically saving a little over $2 million here. People are going to talk about the Brewers being cheap and this, that, and the other. Yeah, it's a cost-saving move. I think it's also, though, a make them slightly more attractive in trades type move as well, because teams are going to like it if they have to pay Devin Williams $2.25 million less than they would have otherwise. There's also just a discussion that needs to be had here about the fact that there is an established way that this stuff tends to work in baseball. Like it or not, teams are not going to pay more money to a player than they have to. And we're not going to dive into, like maybe the ethics of that or the goodwill nature of that. But on the business side of that, that's just a reality. And the Brewers, as baseball's smallest market, they're not going to reset that. They're not going to be the team that makes a decision that now raises the bar for what players are going to be paid. But it happens all the time, but you'll notice that that bar is almost always being raised with free agent contracts by big market teams. Because when you talk about guys who are under their initial years of club control, so arbitration, all of this stuff is based on precedent. And the Brewers, as the smallest market team in baseball, like it or not, they're just not going to be the team that sets precedent for anybody. So they're not going to, in this case, set the precedent of Devin Williams getting that $10.5 million option picked up in his last year of arbitration as an elite reliever who missed over half the season. Because now if there's another Devin Williams at any point in time coming through the Brewers system, now that next version of Devin Williams, that next really good young reliever, he's not going to be able to point to, well, Devin Williams, you picked up his club option for $10.5 million in his last season, and use that as an argument in arbitration. It's not exactly the same thing because you're not comparing ARB salaries, but I think there is still a similar type of thing that goes on here where you are going to make that conflict. That's going to have impacts on what they file for and different things like that on the player side. So the bottom line here really is just, it's a business decision by the Brewers. It's the right business decision. This has nothing to do with how long Devin Williams is controlled by the team. Every big league player is not allowed to hit free agency, unrestricted free agency, assuming their club doesn't release them or do anything like that. They are not allowed to elect free agency until they are wrapping up a season in which they have exceeded 6 full years of service time. During that window, you have that set number of years of club control. So it's either 6 years, or for some guys, it'll be 7 years because of service time manipulation. But during that window, you're signing a new contract every single year. So you're under club control, but you're not necessarily under contract from year to year. That needs to be renewed, or you need to sign a new one. Your first few years, it can be renewed by the team. A lot of times, team and player will just sit down and they'll very quickly hammer out like, hey, we'll give you like X raise over the league minimum, basically. And then after those first 3 years, you get 3 years of arbitration. And then you're signing a new contract every year for those years, especially if you're going through arbitration each year. So it can either be you agree to a new 1-year deal with your team, You file for arbitration. Both sides file their salaries. The judge, the arbiter, declares which salary you're going to get on that 1-year contract until the process repeats the next year. And that happens 3 times. Or what you can do is during that time, within that window of 6 or 7 years, you can sign multi-year contracts that cover more than one of those seasons. But unless you sign a contract that runs beyond those 6 or 7 seasons, it doesn't do anything to change how long that team is able to keep you for. So that's what happened with Devin Williams here. He had 2 seasons of arbitration left, and instead of just agreeing to the 1-year deal to cover that 1 year of arbitration, he agreed to that 1-year deal with a club option that would have covered the 2nd year of arbitration and just given him that guaranteed salary of $10.5 million instead of needing to go through that whole negotiating process again. But because the Brewers knew that by going through that negotiating process again, he was not going to make $10.5 million. He's not going to make $10.5 million. They decided to turn it down because they can get some couple $1,000,000 of savings there. And that either helps their bottom line for payroll or making a profit or whatever, or it helps whichever team the Brewers trade him to. And maybe it can incrementally nudge his trade value in the right direction. If teams see that he's now going to cost them $2.25 million less than he would have if the Brewers had picked up that option. That's what's going on here. I'd be willing to guess Devin Williams probably isn't happy that this is what happened, but this is kind of the way the business side of the game works. You can hate it if you want, but the reality is this is just how it goes. This is not really a special case here. This is just a matter of here's the way the Brewers could have approached this under a different set of circumstances, but because of the way that things unfolded for Devin Williams this season, there was another avenue that was more savvy business-wise for the Brewers to pursue, and they did it. So they can still keep him in that final year through arbitration, so they can either agree to a new deal with him or they can go to the arbiter and have it decided that way. We'll see if he's still with the Brewers by the time that point gets there, that point of him having to go to arbitration or having to file. They could trade him before that. I think this could go a couple different ways. I think from the Brewers' perspective, and I'll get your thoughts on this as well, there's some value in trying to agree to a new 1-year deal with him, because then if you're putting him on the trade block, then teams really know for sure he's locked in for this year at this salary. And I think that can help with, finding suitors and just teams being interested because they can now plan exactly how he's going to fit into that mix, into their payroll, all of this stuff. I think there's a reason to pursue that. At the same time, that might be trickier to pursue now, especially if Devin Williams' camp isn't happy that this option was turned down. And I don't know what the reaction is on his side. But I'd be willing to guess it's certainly not positive, even if they do understand the business side of it. So, we'll see if either side is able to come together on potentially just reaching a different agreement, because I think there's a benefit to doing that. Is that something that will actually happen? Maybe not, but I'm curious what your thoughts are.
Yeah, I have a feeling Devin, at least having witnessed the Hader and Burns things happen the way they did, at least had a decent idea that this was coming. I think his agent and himself had to be aware that given him missing over half of the season, that ARB number was going to be a decent amount lower than 10.5. I think if the Brewers were looking at like an estimate in that upper 9s, close to 10, and you factor in that buyout too, would they maybe eat the $250,000 difference and just say, all right, we'll pick it up. No, there's no reason for anything to, no relationships to be frayed or anything because of this. Yeah, they might have. But when it's over 2 million, most likely, and MLB Trade Rumors has it at like 7.7 million. So there's a chance it's even more than 2.25 million if that ends up being the case. I think almost any team in baseball would have done this. I don't even think this is just necessarily a small market thing. I think most teams would take the opportunity to basically save 2 plus million. I don't want to say for free, but without really having to put in too much work here. Like, I think most teams would jump at that opportunity. And I'm not going to rehash all the arbitration stuff you talked about, but everything's based on precedent. And the Brewers being the team that sets the market, not only could it affect them down the line, but it affects every other team. And when teams set that precedent, other teams aren't huge fans of the people who do that in that moment. Just the way it works out. Like, you kind of have to, in a way, because you're trying to keep the precedent that's been set to be the standard. You don't want to change that standard. And we've seen it with Burns last year. He just agreed to a deal. He didn't want to go through that process again. I kind of have a feeling that's what's going to happen with Devin. Somewhere in between, maybe a little bit over 8 million, they go and they come to an agreement and just say, hey, we're locking you in. Everyone's happy. You know what you're getting paid. The teams that we're trying to negotiate with know what you're getting paid, or we know what we're going to be paying you. Like you said, I think it would probably be the ideal outcome for everyone involved for it to be figured out before it gets too deep into the offseason. So I have a feeling that's what's going to happen. But yeah, otherwise, I mean, you touched on everything I would have hit on. It's not just a Brewers thing, and it's not just a being cheap thing. There's a lot more involvement when it comes to arbitration stuff, and we could talk about that for an entire episode if we wanted to, because it's so in depth. There's so many things, but just know that it wouldn't just be a Brewer thing here. This would be something that most teams would have probably jumped at the opportunity to save a couple $1,000,000.
Yeah, I would wager pretty definitively that there is no team in Major League Baseball that wants to raise the precedent, raise the standard, raise the benchmark unless they absolutely have to. So in
Yep.
free agency, that might be, well, we really want this guy and we know we have to outbid another team. So now you've set a precedent. Okay, fine. But we don't want to do that unless we don't have to. Same deal in arbitration. Like, if a guy, or in extension talks too, if a guy
Yeah.
is comparing to, what some other guy got, we don't want to, unless we have to, raise that bar and now make this guy the highest paid player at X position with X track record at X age with X level of production so far with X number of years of control left, if you're talking arbitration or extension or whatever. There are not a lot of teams that want to do that. Now there can be exceptions. The Brewers gave Jackson Chourio the largest contract for any player who had never stepped in the big leagues. That was also one, though, where guess what? That contract is more than likely, if Chourio is turning into the player that we see him turning into, that contract is going to save the Brewers money. It's going to help them
Yeah.
in the long run. And I actually think working out deals like that is better for baseball than going through the system that's already in place. I'm not going to act like it's perfect or like it's always the most favorable outcome for the player, but I do think it has just more upside as a healthy way of negotiating this stuff. But that's kind of a discussion we can get into in a different podcast. But again, the bottom line here, to kind of sum up all of this rambling, no, this does not change how many years the Brewers could have kept Devin Williams for. No, this is not strictly a Brewers type decision. Just about every other team in baseball would have done the same thing in this situation. And then finally, as far as his trade value, I don't know. I see some people saying this means he's definitely good as gone. I think he was good as gone no matter what, so I'm not sure this actually does
Yeah.
anything to impact it again. Maybe it gives like that slight little nudge in terms of what they can get back, just because teams now know he's going to be making a little bit less. But I don't think this necessarily swings the calculus a whole lot on that front either. So, kind of one of those things that, yeah, if you don't know the nitty gritty of how all of this stuff works, it seems a little confusing. But really, if you're going to try to pick between trying to dive into it and figure out if this changes anything or just saying it probably doesn't change anything, I would lean toward the latter, just for the sake of here's the news, move on with your day.
Yep.
But a couple more option related decisions to talk about here. So the Brewers declined Eric Haas's club option. He's kind of in the same boat, basically. He didn't get nearly the same level of attention because he's not Devin Williams, but they basically did the same thing. He had a $3.5 million team option for 2025. There was no buyout attached to that, so they can just decline that without owing him any more money. But again, he's also arbitration eligible. He's still under those initial years of control that a team has over a player unless they explicitly outright them or release them or whatever. So for that reason, the Brewers are likely going to keep Eric Haas next year as the backup behind William Contreras until Jefferson Cairo is ready. But they're going to do it via arbitration instead of by picking up that team option. Because when they take Eric Haas to arbitration, he's going to make quite a bit less than $3.5 million. That $3.5 million would have been a little bit more along the lines of what he would make in arbitration if he had played the full season basically as like an expanded backup catcher and had a very productive season. That's what it would have taken. But that's not what happened. He spent a good chunk of the year in the minor leagues. Then he was the third catcher, did well in that role, but didn't play a whole lot. So it just makes more sense to do it this way. A couple of mutual options as well. So Wade Miley, mutual option declined. Frankie Montas, mutual option declined. Montas declined himself on his end. And then Gary Sanchez, the Brewers declining his mutual option, giving him a $4 million buyout. They'll give Frankie Montas a $2 million buyout. So mutual options, just for those who may not know, these almost never get picked up. A lot of times their main focus is kind of offsetting some of the money in a contract in the form of that buyout, because then you can choose to kind of decide a little differently how you're going to calculate that into your payroll. If you want, you can then put that $2 million and say that counts towards next year's books instead of the year in question. It can happen a lot of times with like multi-year deals too, because then it's even more beneficial for offsetting some money. So that's basically all that's going on here. Like if you look at Gary Sanchez's contract, for example, when it was reworked, his base salary for 2024 went down by quite a bit. But then there's this buyout on the mutual option of $4 million because he made under $4 million base salary in 2024, right?
$3 million.
So then he had So then you add the $4 million buyout on. He's getting what, like in that range of $7 to $8 million then. Basically for his contributions with the Brewers, but not all of that counts for the in-season 2024 payroll is basically what's going on here. That mutual option is never getting picked up, but it's kind of a way to offset some money like that. For a mutual option to be picked up, both sides have to exercise their end of the option. That almost never happens. So Patrick asked us a question about Frankie Montas because it was Montas who declined his end of the mutual option. He said it just seemed interesting to him that Montas was the one to officially decline his side of the option. And then he just talks about, do you think there is enough there to kind of inspire some interest between both sides to come back on a similar deal to the one that he signed with the Reds going into this year? So first of all, with mutual options, sometimes the player will just be the one to officially file to reject it if they know that their team is going to pick it up. So that's probably what happened here, because I don't think Frankie Montas is necessarily going to get $20 million annual value on the free agent market. Maybe he gets a multi-year deal with the season he had. I think it's a possibility. But even so, he's probably not looking at anything too spectacular. So it's one of those things too where there's just really no harm in turning it down because, like you mentioned, you can still negotiate with the Brewers for a new deal. That's just kind of the way it goes. If you look at what the Brewers and Wade Miley did last offseason, Miley turned down his mutual option. The Brewers came right back and they restructured a new deal. Do I think that will happen with Frankie Montas? I could see a This is going to sound like a weird comp. There's a little bit of Colin Rayness here in the sense of he acclimated himself quite well to the Brewers, and he's got the 3 fastball profile. Obviously, he throws 96 to 98. Colin Ray does not, but there are some similarities there. I will say Montas endeared himself very well to the clubhouse as well. It was actually kind of impressive seeing for just the relative to a lot of guys on the team, lack of time he was there, how quickly he assimilated to everybody and just kind of became one of the guys. And you could see him spending a lot of time too with some of these younger players, just hanging around him a little bit. So I wouldn't rule it out. I'm not expecting it though. I think that if you're the Brewers, you now have just a wider scope of free agents. And my guess is there are probably guys out there who you think can give you that Frankie Montas production for a little bit less than he might want to sign for. It's a little bit different in season when that pool shrinks a little bit now, and all of a sudden you're scrambling to fill that role. I think that's part of the reason why you trade for Frankie Montas in that situation, but maybe he's not someone you look to sign to the kind of deal that he was on with the Reds or the kind of deal that he might get in free agency this year. But I wouldn't rule it out. I would say it's probably more likely that the Brewers go a different way.
Yeah. Yep. I agree. I think like you got to witness it a little bit more firsthand, but it seemed pretty clear even just on TV and through everything else we saw from him that the guys embraced him quickly. He did the same to his teammates. And like you said, you could see him around a lot of the younger guys, especially. So if the deal is right, yeah, I could absolutely see him back. I don't think I would give him close to what he got from the Reds last year. He got a pretty nice chunk of change from the Reds last year, including this $2 million buyout on top of it. I'm not sure he will get that again on the open market. And if it falls into a nice, reasonable deal where the Brewers think that they can get a bunch of decent innings and have a guy that maybe, you are losing a guy like Willy. If there's somebody who's really good in the clubhouse, you might find a little bit of extra value in that this particular offseason. But I still think it's probably less likely than it is probable to happen. I just don't think there's a very high chance of it happening. But I could see it under the right circumstances. I think they'd welcome him back. I just don't know if those circumstances will kind of fall into place how the Brewers would want him to.
Now we're going to rapid fire some remaining moves from these last couple days here. So basically, for anyone who doesn't know, there's not only these deadlines that come up pretty quickly after the World Series for deciding options, but then on Monday there was also a deadline that kind of coincided with that for having your 40-man roster set. So once you get to this deadline, you need to activate everybody off the 60-day IL and they rejoin your 40-man roster. So that means that the Brewers had to clear quite a few spots because they had to activate Brandon Woodruff, Christian Yelich, JB Bukauskas, Ali Dunn, and Robert Gasser from the 60-day IL. So that's what, 1, 2, 3, that's 5 spots that you have to clear there. And to do that, that means you got to kind of usher some guys out. So we talked about, Ray's off the 40-man, Frankie's off the 40-man, Gary's off the 40-man. They had to make a couple more moves as well to also just give themselves some flexibility as well. They could have stopped at some of these moves and been right at 40, but there's just benefit to doing it up front because now you have the flexibility, you have spots to work with as well. So the 40-man roster is now at 36 because of these additional subtractions. The Brewers waived Kevin Herget and Rob Zastryzny, a couple of veteran relievers who I think are both MLB caliber relievers, like middle relievers, but the Brewers have a surplus at that position. Zastryzny for sure is out of options. I think Herget may have had one more next year, but I could be wrong on that one. But either way, just guys who are ahead of them on the pecking order. So they waived both of those guys. The Cubs claimed Rob Zastryzny, who actually was the Cubs are the organization he started his career with, so kind of a full circle moment for him. And then the New York Mets claimed Kevin Herget off waivers, so both of those guys gone. And then Jake Bauers and Bryce Wilson were also put on waivers. They went unclaimed. outrighted to AAA Nashville, and then both of those guys electing free agency because they were outrighted in the offseason. So 4 more subtractions from the 40 man, and that's what gives you those 4 open spots now that the Brewers have to work with. Nothing really crazy here. Again, 2 guys in Zastryzny and Herget who I think have value, but they were so far down on the pecking order at a position of strength. It just, you're kind of trimming fat around the edges of your roster. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way towards some of these players, but these are guys the Brewers could afford to lose. So, they were able to use them to clear some spots. Bowers and Wilson. Again, I was very big on the Jake Bowers train for most of the season. In fact, this is an idea that I had that we can do for one of the offseason episodes, revisiting predictions that we made at various points throughout the year that either aged well or aged poorly. The Jake Bowers one is one that would age poorly on my end. He was pretty productive for a good chunk of the season in the role he was asked to fill. But basically, once we got into August, the bottom just kind of fell out. The strikeouts spiraled way out of control to the point where he just could not be productive. So he finished as a slightly below replacement level player. So not really surprising to see the Brewers cut ties there. And then Bryce Wilson. We've talked about Bryce Wilson's value. He gives you value out of the bullpen as just kind of the innings eater guy. He did not make the playoff roster, though, because like we talked about in that episode, he just does not have the ceiling to be a short sample guy on the roster, like a guy who could really impact a short series, and especially a situation where it's like you do need to try to win every single game you can. And just another guy, too, who the Brewers got everything they could out of him. Bryce Wilson does not have good stuff. I think that both he and the Brewers should be commended for being able to get what they got out of him. But the reality is he doesn't have anything that really jumps out in terms of velocity or movement or the angles he creates. I think he did a very good job with sequencing and knowing where to attack guys, and I think that helped him out a lot. Switching to that cutter helped. The cutter is a decent pitch for him, especially when you play it off the running fastball, and he did a good job of, even if that sinker isn't a pitch that runs or sinks a ton relative to other sinkers, he did a good job of pounding it into righties, and that helped him be very productive. He was actually one of the better pitchers in baseball results-wise against righties during the time he was here, but he was not good against lefties because he lacked really anything that could be a productive pitch to lefties. The cutter shape on kind of the fastball to slider spectrum, it was not close enough to a fastball to be super effective to lefties. The ones that are closer to a fastball can be very effective against lefties, but his was a little bit more in the middle, and that's a pitch that lefties can sometimes hit a little bit better. Matt Trueblood has actually talked about some of this stuff too, kind of cutter shapes and how that impacts their effectiveness. But again, just a guy who also out of options as well, so he doesn't really help you with roster flexibility on that front. Just you have guys like Aaron Ashby now and DL Hall who, if they don't crack the rotation, are guys who can be a little bit more better fits, I guess, for kind of the swingman type role, and they have a little bit more upside. So just things to keep in mind there. But both of those guys electing free agency, they are now minor league free agents. With that, unless you have anything pressing to add on any of these moves, we can, before we go to the minor league sandbox, just talk about what's next for the Brewers this offseason. We have some more deadlines coming up in the month of November. The next one to really pay attention to is November 19th. That is the deadline to protect Rule 5 eligible players. We've talked about this one before. I believe I've said Logan Henderson and Coleman Crow are the two who I think are going to be added. I think everybody else is going to be left off because you can't protect that many players. It's probably not the best way to use your 40-man roster spots, and other teams recognize that as well. So even if there are guys who you very much don't want to lose, you may still not protect those guys because you know that there's a very high likelihood they're just not going to get picked because it's not worthwhile for a lot of teams. So I threw out my 2 names again to rehash that. Spencer is the minor league expert. Did you have anyone different, or did we say the same thing? I know we talked about Chad Patrick too. I said no on him.
Yeah, I think by the end of it, I was on board with what you were saying. I think there's no way they protect Henderson, Patrick, and Crow, and I think Crow and Henderson give you the more. There's more upside there. There's a
Mhm.
better chance of them actually being like major league starters down the line than somebody like Patrick. And I think Patrick could potentially, honestly, when you look at Patrick, it kind of reminds me a little bit of the Bryce Wilson type of thing when you look at it a little bit. That's probably more what his ceiling kind of is. So I think there's two other names that I think they'll consider, and they're tough because I do think they're both guys I could see teams taking a chance on, but like Jack said, there are limited 40-man spots for everybody. So even though, every team is probably dealing with a few guys where it's like, ooh, you'd hate to lose them, but what are the chances somebody's actually going to grab them? And you just kind of got to weigh those chances. But Shane Smith is a relief prospect who has pretty good stuff. He's got mid to upper 90s at times with the fastball. It's a really good curveball. He actually started a lot this year and he added a slider, at least started throwing it more consistently. It's not a bad pitch either. He didn't make it past AA, so it just feels like he's probably a year removed still from somebody actually feeling confident enough to put him in a major league bullpen, even. So he's probably safe, I would imagine. And then the other one is Ernesto Martinez Jr. And we did get a question from Dylan on that, just asking, have we added Ernesto Martinez Jr. to the 40 man? We haven't. First of all, there'd be no real need to until November 19th. So that's the other thing. The Brewers will wait to protect all of these guys until November 19th because it allows them the flexibility that Jack talked about. If you can have 40 or 40-man spots open at any time, you might as well, because it gives you the opportunity to make waiver claims, try and fit them. You can claim someone off waivers, try and DFA them themselves just to try and kind of sneak them through and keep them in your org. Like it gives you a lot of room to maneuver. So on the 19th is when they'll see any of these guys. Ernesto was a minor league free agent. He re-signed as a minor league free agent. It seems unlikely somebody would draft him because if they wanted to, they could have just signed him to a major league deal. Now, he technically re-signed before the market would have opened for that to happen. But I think agents would have an idea of what their value might be around the league. They have plenty of ins with teams and an understanding of how things are going to work. If they thought Ernesto might get a major league deal, he would have remained a free agent and taken the opportunity to negotiate with a bunch of different teams. So I think the Brewers and Ernesto are probably pretty confident he would not have gotten a major league deal, which means it's very unlikely someone's going to sign him or going to draft him in the Rule 5 draft. But I do think he's somebody that could impact the Brewers at one point this year. It wouldn't surprise me. Guy hits the ball as hard as anyone. His 90th percentile EV exit velo for AA was over 109 this year. And he's a crazy athlete over at first base. So there's a lot to work with. I think he's probably, of the position players, the only guy they would even somewhat consider protecting, but I don't see it happening. I think he probably is safe. And also I don't think they would use a 40-man spot to do that. So those are the 5 total names: Henderson, Patrick, Crow, Shane Smith, and Ernesto Martinez that I think they'll consider. I would consider anyone else they protect a major, major shock that they must have something they absolutely love behind the scenes that we can't see from our perspective. But those are the 5 names that I think they're going to look at.
A few days after that deadline to protect guys from the Rule 5 draft is the tender deadline on November 22nd. So we've talked a lot about arbitration in that episode. This is the deadline then for extending or tendering a future contract to a player who is arbitration eligible. You can either tender them and then plan to go through that process, or you can just non-tender them before that whole process even starts and then they become free agents. So this is kind of an area where the free agent market starts to accumulate some more bounce back candidates, guys that the Brewers might be interested in signing in free agency. We talked a lot about Devin Williams and Eric Haas. So Devin Williams, his projected arbitration salary is 7.7 million, according to MLB trade rumors, and their model has been pretty accurate since they
Yeah,
started
they're
doing that
good.
a few years ago. So that's a fairly safe number to pencil in. Eric Haas, his projected arbitration salary is 1.8 million, and then compare that to the 3.5 million club option, like we talked about. So there are going to be some savings there for the Brewers. The remaining guys on this list who are arbitration eligible, you have Hobie Milner, Aaron Savali, Yoel Payamps. William Contreras is going to get a pretty big raise in arbitration. He's projected for 7.6 million. And then you have Nick Mears and Trevor McGill. I guess we can touch on this really quickly, kind of what we expect to happen here, and we can revisit it when we get closer to that date. But to me, the two non-tender candidates here are Hobie Milner and Yoel Payamps. Before I go into my rationale, I guess I can throw it to you. Do you have anybody else, or do you disagree with any of those names?
No, I think if Ray had been brought back, then potentially Savali, but I still think they would have probably found like a trade for Savali. I think Savali at 8 million, which is
Yep.
his estimate, is a reasonable
Mhm.
cost. So I wouldn't expect it at all now, but I think maybe if Ray had come back, I could have seen that being on the table
Yeah,
a little bit more.
and I think even right now, I think Savali's a tender and trade candidate still,
Yeah, for sure.
because it's just a matter of like, he's a valuable, again, like this useful back of the rotation, eat some innings guy. But the question, especially if you're the Brewers, who have done such a good job at maximizing these kinds of guys for short stretches of time, like within a season or two, do you think that maybe you can trade Aaron Savali for some other assets that can help you, and then for 8 million you can sign two, maybe even three guys who are candidates now to kind of be a back of the rotation innings eater type if you can optimize them a little more? Is that the route that you decide to take? But I think he's going to get tendered a contract, and then I think he becomes a trade candidate. But the Milner is an obvious one just because he did not have a great season, so the Brewers are not going to want to give him the 2.7 million he's projected for. Yoel Payamps, the cost is pretty reasonable. I think it's 2.8 million for his projection, and I think he's earned that. For me, the sticking point is that he's out of options, and
Yep.
I think this is going to be kind of one of the background goals. And I mean background in the sense of like it's not something people think about all the time, but it's something that the Brewers are probably going to have to focus on. Um, you know, on top of some more prominent goals. But the Brewers need to restore a little bit of flexibility, roster management flexibility to their bullpen, because they have a lot of guys right now in that mix. If you look at like roster resource and look at their projected bullpen, it's like 6 out of the 8 guys are either out of options or they're so important to the bullpen that you can't use their
Right.
options. So guys like Trevor McGill and Jared Koenig, like they're going to need to do some reshuffling simply to restore a little bit more flexibility. Because if you're going to continue to lean on your bullpen heavily, I think you need the ability to shuttle more guys than the Brewers were able to this year. They made it work with some 40-man maneuvering, but there were times throughout the season where it was like, well, Kevin Herget is still up here, but he had to throw like 42 pitches in the last 2 days. But they also
Yeah.
don't really have another spot that they can use to kind of shuttle guys back and forth. So I think for that reason, Payamps is a non-tender candidate because he's out of options. I think that as important as he's been, he does kind of restrict the bullpen's flexibility. So if he gets non-tendered, you non-tender Hobie, you trade Devin Williams, all of a sudden things start to open up a lot more because then you can roster Abner Uribe, Elvis Figueroa, JB Bukowskis can come back next year. Those are guys who have options left. They all have, I believe, they all have one option year left in 2025. So that now, because I don't think JB used his because he was on the IL for almost the entire year.
Right. Yep.
because he was granted a fourth option last year, and then he spent almost the whole year on the IL. So I believe that carries over into 2025. So those guys all have an option left. It just gives you more room to shuttle guys around, and I think that's going to be a big factor there. So Piamps might be the end of the line for him. Hobie Milner, I think he's going to have his time in walking him to close. Savali's a tender and trade candidate, but otherwise everybody else should be coming back. So that's kind of a preview of some headlines that you might be able to expect in the coming weeks. With that, now that we've gotten through all of that, we can transition to Spencer's favorite part of the show. It's the minor league sandbox, where Spencer talks about everything that's going on in the minor leagues. And I know mainly the reason that we're still including it this week is we got some questions on minor leaguers. So would you like to take it away?
I would love to. Yeah, like Jack said, we got a few questions. Really, they're all from Ralph, and honestly, they just got submitted a little bit too late last week, so we're taking them now. But his first question was regarding Hedbert Perez, who I actually talked a little bit about last episode. He asked, does Hedbert have as much shine on him now as he did pre-injury? And it's a tough question a little bit because I'm curious if he's talking more about, a year prior to his injury where he was a huge prospect and getting a lot of attention, or if he's talking about right before he got hurt, which was at that point he had already kind of fallen off the prospect map. I would say compared to where he was right before the injury, I think it's pretty similar. He did fine this year coming back. He had never been above low A. He came back off his injury playing in high A. He showed some decent things. He's currently playing in the Dominican Summer League where he's doing pretty well. He's got a 910 OPS. He's got 3 doubles, a triple. His walks and strikeouts are both in an okay place it's still a 33 plate appearance sample, but there's still something there with Hedbert. He hits the ball as hard as anybody his age still. He's a pretty decent defender, decent arm, not the fastest guy in the world, but an okay base runner. Like, it's mostly the bat you're banking on, but I do think there's still something there. He is Rule 5 eligible this year. He's not getting picked, but that does show kind of where his organizational clock is in terms of he's only got a year or two left before he's a minor league free agent. And at that point, that's when it's kind of put up or shut up time, I guess, is for lack of a better term for him going into next year. You kind of need to see the jump that you've been waiting for a few years in 2025. On the note of guys who are sort of in a similar boat to what Hedbert once was, he asked about 3 DSL players, Jesus Mate, Luis Pena, and Jose Anderson. He's asking, do they make it to the Mudcats next year? I think Mate is as close to a lock as you can have to make the opening day roster for the Mudcats. He's looking like an absolute star prospect now. He's still very young. There's still a very long way to go. But if they push guys like Yoferi Rodriguez and Luis Lara, and obviously Churio, they're going to do the same with Mate. I think Pena is as close. Pena is at least in like the Yoferi and the Luis Lara type of category. I think he's got a decent chance to make it right away next year. He might be somebody that spends a little bit of time in extended spring training and then makes it to Carolina. Hard to say on that. There is a lot of infield depth at the lower levels of the minors right now. That might be the only reason he doesn't right away. But he's another one he's a legit prospect. And Anderson's more of he was a really low signing bonus. I think it was 60,000. Hit the ball really hard. He had bigger whiff issues than the other two, but they weren't bad. They were still above average numbers for his level. But he's not quite the same level of prospect. He's more in that, probably a step below even the Yoferi and Lara coming out of the DSL. But he also plays the outfield, which is a little bit less. There's less depth there. So I would imagine he's more likely to start in extended spring and then maybe make it to the Mudcats. But it wouldn't shock me if he just ends up playing in the complex league instead of making it to Carolina right away. But he is another one. I think all 3 of them have a chance. I would just put Mate as a lock, basically. Pena as at least like 75% chance of him being there very quickly. And then Anderson, I'd probably put more in like the 25 to 50%. Like I wouldn't rule it out by any means, but hard to say for sure on him. He's a little bit lower on the totem pole in terms of prospecting. And then the other question, another international signing from a few years ago, Juan Baez. He's playing in the AFL right now. He asked, does Baez move faster through the system now that he's healthy? I think he's moving pretty quickly, to be honest. He's already been in low A as a 19-year-old. That's, I know we've all been a little bit spoiled by the Cheerios and such of the world, but a 19-year-old playing in low A is no joke. That's an impressive timeline. He's still 19 playing in the AFL right now. One of the youngest players there, posting a 10-10 OPS currently. He's made some solid defensive plays, which was a question for him at times. He seems to have some trouble with the routine plays where it might be a lack of focus or something along those lines, but I think he could be a solid defender at second base and especially at third. I think he's shown good instincts, and he's showing pretty well in the AFL. So that kind of handles the three questions we had. And then I have one small Arizona Fall League update. Brock Wilken still not performing super well. OPS after a home run today is up to about 560, but he'll be participating in the home run derby for the AFL. Fun little thing for him to do. Potentially a boost of confidence if he performs well. I mean, you never know what types of things could help a guy get himself out of a rut. But at the very least, hopefully something he can enjoy. I think just having a little bit of fun playing baseball would probably go a long way for Brock Wilken right now. So hopefully he does well in that. Like I said, he hit a home run today after the news was announced yesterday. So maybe he'll start getting hot and have a really nice finish to the AFL, where that would be good for him. I think it'd be good for Brewers fans to just be able to see a little bit more production. But more than anything, I think just a boost to his confidence would go a long way. And yeah, so hopefully that brings it. And then I guess one other thing I should bring up, because we talked about Oliver Dunn, he did start playing in the Dominican Winter League as well. He's had 7 plate appearances. He's got 1 hit, 1 walk. There's nothing really to talk about in terms of stats, but just the fact that he's finally back out there playing in games after dealing with his injury that ended his season. And just honestly, I don't think anyone thought it was going to be as long of a time off as it ended up being. So it's just good to see him playing games. Like I've said before, I think he's a guy who might sneakily impact the team a little bit more than people might be envisioning at the moment. So hopefully he can get back into a groove there and carry that over into a solid spring, and then help the major league team next year, because he's got the talent to do it. So yeah, that's all I got on the sandbox, Jack. You can swing back in.
I did swing back in. That's all we have for you this week. I know we've kind of mentioned it a few times. The general plan for the off season is podcast every other week, but that will change sometimes if we have enough news that prompts a podcast in the moment while that remains topical. So that's what happened here. We had a lot of not only that deadline coming up, but I think a couple of decisions that not all of them were expected. The Colin Ray one I think was worth diving into a little more, and then also just kind of seeing the confusion sparked by that Devin Williams decision. I think that was worth talking about. So we'll kind of operate under the same format for the rest of the year. So if nothing incredibly pressing that's really worth diving into happens during that time, the next time you'll hear from us will be in a couple weeks. If something does happen, we'll jump back on here as soon as we can to break it down for you. So thank you all for listening, and happy off season. We're fully underway now.